I'm Aubrey Sitterson. And this is SKALD. You're about to hear my ongoing fantasy serial. Like the SKALD it's named after, I've written these tales to be heard, not read, and there's no music, sound effects, or character actors. It's all me, and I do it in one single, flawless take. This episode starts where the last one ended, so if you always like to hear a story from the beginning, you might want to go back and listen to previous episodes before moving ahead. This isn't me reading you a story. This is me telling you a story. This is SKALD, Part 18. Maul couldn't move. No, that wasn't quite right. He could move. He could command his muscles as easily as ever. He could order them to contract and expand. He could demand that his entire body, that his entire being, rage against his surroundings. Which is exactly what he did. But though he issued those royal decrees, though he knew that he was flailing his arms, knew that his legs were pumping up and down as his body leaned forward into an explosive sprint, though he knew all of this to be true, though he felt the motion in his body when he looked down, he remained still. No matter how much he moved, the truth was, he remained motionless, held in stasis, trapped in amber. It surrounded him. Not amber, something far, far darker. Heavy, oppressive, and viscous, a gelatinous mass that covered every inch of his being. It was as black as never-ending night, as dark as the bottomless sea, as impenetrable as space itself, impossibly. Maul could see through it, could see through that impermeable goo well enough to tell that it was everywhere, omnipresent, spreading its frantic dread and overwhelming fear of the inevitable to every dark corner of the massive room. All Maul could see was black. It filled his vision, creeping through his pupils into his brain, blanketing that shattered mindscape with heavy, oppressive, unending darkness. Though there was no light, Maul could still make out shapes, twisting paths of black, just different enough to stand out from the gelatinous ooze that didn't just prevent movement, but negated its very existence. The shapes were pipes, long and short, fat and thin, pipes of some dull black metal that filled the room, existing both where the heavy darkness did not, as well as within it. Maul knew not what this place was. He knew nothing at all. All his mind saw was that debilitating mixture of fear and fatalism, agonizing, petrifying terror imbued with the knowledge that there is nothing you can do about it, nothing you could have done about it, and nothing you can ever do about it but shrink, cower, and accept your personal hell. Suddenly, Maul's empty brain, blanketed with that oppressive, omnipotent darkness, it swelled as it was filled with two simultaneous thoughts. One, that Maul must escape. And two, that he could not, never would. He flexed his muscles. What else could he do? And he felt them weighed down from without and within, absorbing the darkness as it consumed him. What he thought had been silence soon revealed itself to be far from it. His ears had rung with the overwhelming vacuum, a silence unnatural and unheard of, one that made his head spin, that would have knocked him to the ground if he was still capable of movement. But now that silence was supplanted, replaced by something that roared just as loud, reassuring in its vanquishing of the silence, but terrifying in its cacophonous rise. Louder and louder, something rushed through the pipes. Though Maul could still observe no movement, he felt the pipe's wicked vibrations through the ooze that surrounded him. Though there was no variation in the monotonous roar, Maul could hear the depraved machinery that pumped obscene turpitude through the pipes. In a single instant, Maul knew nothing and he knew nothingness. Once again, he marshaled his considerable strength and tried to run, but though he felt himself propelled for 100 yards, he looked down to see. He had failed to so much as twitch a muscle. He was stranded in the room, trapped amongst its buzzing pipes and its roaring, hidden machinery. He thrashed. His mind and body alike, they thrashed, raging against the truth, the unavoidable blackness that surrounded him. If this was hell, he would raise a clamor so riotous, so tumultuous, that it would torture the devils themselves. If Maul must suffer, then he would do his very best to repay his captors in kind, as he always had. He opened his mouth to scream, and miraculously, it worked. For the first time, his muscles obeyed his commands. He could feel his mouth opening. He knew that his jaws had unclenched, had spread his sharp, gleaming teeth wide, preparing to unleash the roar, bubbling up inside of him. But as Maul went to push out those unbridled screams, something pushed back. The darkness. It poured into Maul's open mouth, pushing deep into his being. Not that it needed to, because it had been within him all along. SKALD was frightfully fast. She tore along the riverbed, bursting through the brush, leaping over rocks and fallen trees, sending all manner of wildlife scattering from her destructive, single-minded path. Her companion, Maul, lay behind her. Whether he was alive or dead, she knew not. But even if she had stayed by his side, he was far beyond her help now. She couldn't heal him. She couldn't nurse him back to health. She wasn't made for that. She was made for the hunt. And so that's exactly what she would do. The Farah dove into the river and begun swimming along with the current. SKALD had seen his head pop up only once, maybe twice, for air. The Farah had working arrangements with all of nature, including that rushing torrent of water. SKALD could do many things. She could run, she could climb, she could leap, scratch, claw, bite, maim, and kill. She could do these with aplomb. But swimming, this was not one of her talents. So she ran alongside the river, climbed when necessary, and leapt when helpful, all in anticipation of the moment when she caught up with the Farah, the one who had injured her companion and stolen from him. She lived for the moment when she would be able to exercise the rest of her talents. She ran for hours. Though she ran at full speed, it wasn't enough to overtake her quarry. As the river narrowed and began rushing ever faster, carrying the Farah away from her and the retribution she must mete out. Her stomach had begun to twitch and spasm. Her inner fire had been burning hot, and she was in desperate need of fuel. But as she galloped ahead, refusing to let her paws slow for even a second, she was suddenly confronted with two very distinct smells. Raging cook fires, and more importantly, a wet, bleeding Farah. SKALD slowed down drastically, dropping her massive frame closer to the earth, part of an effort to not only track, but also obscure her movements from her prey. The trail was fresh. It hadn't been long since the Farah came out of the river. The path led into the dense, dark forest of that unexplored gorge, heading in the same direction as the cook fires, the ones that spit out the acrid smoke that floated through the trees. But beneath that caustic smell, SKALD could sense something else. Beasts that were unfamiliar to her, but that seemed to accompany the Farah into the woods. She crept through the brush, moving carefully, silently, using her natural, streaked coloration to camouflage herself as she advanced slowly upon the clearing. Once to the edge, she gazed out curiously in the failing light of dusk, and there, in the meager twilight that filtered through the old-growth trees, she saw it. Skog didn't have the words to describe what she saw. She didn't have words at all, but what she observed was something as horrifying as it was alluring, as exciting as it was disgusting. She saw a bacchanal. They danced wildly, with complete abandon, their bare feet, paws, and hooves digging into the mulch of 1,000 years. Growth, decay, death, and rebirth. Maenads, swinging their wild hair, out of which peeked even wilder eyes. Nymphs flowing in and out of the trees and rocks where they made their homes, and chasing them all, cackling and chortling as they ran. Satyrs of all shapes and sizes, old and young alike, but all clutching something. Whether an instrument, a jug of wine, or more often than not, both. There were multiple cook fires burning in the clearing, their flames licking up at gorgeous, marbled sides of meat run through with spits. Though none of the satyrs appeared to be working at anything but chasing their prey, the fires were somehow tended. The meat turned on the spit, and though every single one of the goat-like beasts was too busy laughing to place a flute to his mouth, the clearing was nonetheless filled with a raucous, dissonant tune. Skog sat silently, scanning the churning crowds for the Pharaoh. But though her keen eyes pored over that tableau again and again, she could find no sign of her quarry. While searching, though, her eyes met those of an older, heavy-set satyr who stood watching the cat, his wise old eyes accustomed to seeing that which would rather remain unseen. He strode across the clearing toward Skog, leading with his considerable paunch. He wore it proudly, the way a man carries something he had built himself. Skog watched, transfixed, as he approached. There was some otherness to him, something she couldn't place, but that wasn't unusual in this barrier realm with its dual suns and bizarre inhabitants. But underneath that otherness, something primal. Something base and something true. Something of the wild places where Skog felt most at home. Skog emerged warily from the brush, but was soon put at ease by the grinning old satyr, who knew all the right places to scratch the massive cat beast. She tried to fight it, but it was no use, as his nimble fingers massaged the spot, her favorite spot, the one right behind her jaw. Skog allowed the lids of her eyes to lower and began to emit a low, gentle purr. Her purring grew louder and more satisfied as the satyr silently led her into the clearing, then gestured to the nymphs and maenads, who showered Skog with kisses as they wove flowers into her thick fur. The music swelled around Skog as the assembled revelers encircled her, caressing her not only with their hands, but with their sweet words as well. One dark-eyed young satyr skipped forward, holding a juicy, steaming slab of meat from the fire, exquisitely cooked. But as Skog moved toward it, her stomach urging her forward, she was overwhelmed by a putrid odor. Though the meat appeared flawless, though it had been cooked expertly, though the smells wafting out from the cook fires had been heavenly, up close, Skog could tell there was clearly something wrong with, something unnatural about the meat. Before she could react, the paunchy old satyr scowled at his younger companion, shooing him away. He then turned to Skog and smiled a smile as sweet as ripened fruit, as fresh as the morning dew, then led her gently across the clearing and into the woods beyond. Whether because of the faltering light, the presence of some mineral in the soil, or something else entirely, these woods looked far different from those that had lined the river. dark, with dense moss hanging down from the branches and creeping up the trunks of trees that appeared gnarled, twisted, and drawn in upon themselves. These were not the mighty lords of the forest that Skog had climbed during her trip south, but were instead the guardians of something old, dark, and sinister. The satyr led Skog away from the clearing, and when they were just far enough away that the songs and laughter began to recede, they came upon the cave. It was hidden by those gnarled, twisted trees, with a wide mouth that narrowed quickly and led downward even faster. The satyr took Skog to the entrance, crouched down next to the beast, the monstrous creature that could rip the satyr to bits in the time it took to look at him. He smiled sweetly at Skog once again, then kissed her on her head and gestured toward the cave. Skog stood, puzzled, staring at the cave as the satyr skipped back through the forest, eager to return to the party and make up for the lost time he had spent tending to Skog. She trusted the satyr. He wasn't good, but she knew she could trust him. She could smell it on his breath. But she could now smell something else as well, a malodorous scent that grew stronger the closer she got to the cave, the same stench that had come from that curious meat. Skog put her nose to the dirt, struggling to smell past the stink of that vile meat, closing her eyes to focus her efforts in but one of her senses. And then she found it. The object of her hunt, that cowardly, bleeding, soaking wet. Farah. He'd been here, through the forest and into the cave. Like all wise men, the satyr knew more than he was willing to say. So without another thought, Skog entered the cave. Inside, it was as dark as night, but Skog's eyes only needed a moment to adjust, allowing her to make out the floor, the ceiling, the cavern walls, and everything in between. The floor was steep, heading downward at a shocking rate, but Skog braced herself, lowering her center of gravity as she crept further into the cave. Soon, the tunnel wound around to the right, opening up into a gruesome cavern. Driven into the ceiling above, sharing space with ancient stalactites, heavy chains hung down with cruel, twisting hooks at their end. Some of the hooks were empty, but far too many of them were heavily laden with the motionless, bloodied bodies. Travelers. Most had been stripped naked, with long chunks of skin and flesh sliced from their bodies. There were humans, elves, dwarves, and races that Skog couldn't even identify, but all of them shared one thing. A look of complete, all-consuming terror, twisted onto their faces. Skog wasn't the only thing alive in this place that hung heavy with death, wasn't the only thing still drawing breath in this charnel house. At the other end of the cavern, looking up from their grisly work, long twisting daggers in their hands, were two of his grimacing, inhuman supplicants. These were not the debauched zealots that Maul had dealt with back in the nameless city, however. No, these supplicants, while still older than most anything in that gorge, were in the prime of their lives, with thick black hair and muscles that rippled as they cut long, gruesome chunks of meat, then piled them on the floor in a growing, bloody abomination. The supplicants turned to face Skog, whose hair rose all along the length of her spine as she crouched down and let out a hiss that caused the hairs on the supplicants' backs to rise as well. The supplicants, sheathing their daggers, let out ghastly chuckles in response, then gestured at Skog to follow them before turning around and heading through an open doorway. Skog picked her way through that odious slaughterhouse, dodging the ruined bodies that the supplicants had left swinging, and when she emerged in the next chamber, she found it less abhorrent, but no less oppressive and worrisome. The statue, with its glowing gold antlers, dominated the room, looming ominously over the stone altar, stained crimson with blood that was spilt before the worlds were sundered. And off to the side, the two supplicants that Skog had seen. They stood with their detestable grins plastered on their bestial faces, eyes glued to their leader, dressed similarly but wearing an ornate choker, a sign of office pulled so tight that Skog could see the open sores it created in the gray flesh of the priest's neck. And before him, lying on the ground, covered in ancient dirt and even older gore, his hands and feet bound in heavy manacles, lay the Pharaoh. His eyes were full of terror, tears, and a wish for death. He lay upon the ground, twitching wildly, weeping uncontrollably, his chest heaving in fear and anticipation. Growl rose up instinctively in Skog's throat. She waited for the cry for mercy that her growl always prompted, but when the Pharaoh opened his mouth, she saw that his tongue had been cut out, as the only thing that poured from his lips was thick, bubbling blood, as black as night, and a pitiable gurgle. Good. The priest reached into his robes, then flung that long, twisting alabaster horn down upon the ground. Now, choose. Skog understood, but it wasn't a choice she wanted to make. She wanted to not only devour what was left of the Pharaoh, to not only retrieve Maul's horn, but also to launch herself at his loathsome supplicants, ravaging them as badly as they had done the travelers they had preyed upon. But as Skog considered all this, she saw more supplicants enter the room, carrying their long, twisted, wicked blades. They came from the path that brought her, as well as some hidden doorway beyond the altar, and there appeared to be no end to their swelling, silent, expectant numbers. The priest clapped his hands a single time, snapping Skog out of her deliberations. Choose. With the growl still growing in her throat, Skog spared one last look at the quivering, devastated Pharaoh, and leaned her massive head down, took the horn up in her jaw. She stared at the priest, narrowing her eyes at him as that rictus grin crept across his gray, wicked countenance, and when she couldn't stand it staring back at her any longer, she turned and left the chamber that was now full of supplicants, breathing heavily, staring at the thrashing, spasming Pharaoh with gazes full of unnatural hate, hunger, and lust. Skog moved quickly to leave the cave and its horrors behind, but she wasn't quick enough to escape the unnatural, stomach-churning, unintelligible screams of the Pharaoh Raider. If you like SKALD, please help spread the word with a review on iTunes or Stitcher. It helps new people find the podcast, and if you say nice stuff, I'll read it on the show. This week, though, I've got something even better than a review. A shout-out. Matt Ballard is, get this, my very first SKALD Patreon supporter. Back before I even had rewards figured out, back when I just barely set up the Patreon itself, Matt dug SKALD so much that he went to patreon.com/SKALD, signed up, and started tossing me some dough each and every month for this weekly serial. Go find him on Twitter at NerdUnfiltered. NerdUnfiltered. Matt's generosity is especially rad because he has his own show, the Startup Gamers Podcast, which is brought to you by Tabletop Torch, your tabletop game creation guide. Personally, I suggest that you go check out episode number 33 of the Startup Gamers Podcast, seeing as the special guest is none other than me. And I talk about writing SKALD, playing role-playing games, and much, much more. If you want a rad shout-out like this, or you just want to help me keep SKALD going with $1 a month, there's only one place for it. Patreon.com/SKALD. I am all over the internet. Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, they're all Aubrey Sitterson. No spaces, no numbers. Or head over to my website, AubreySitterson.com, for links to everything, including social media, my non-SKALD related projects, comics, podcasts, t-shirts, credits, bio, and contact information. Have I got a recommendation for you? Have I got a recommendation for you? On tour, right now, promoting their new album, Luminiferous, are one of my absolute favorite bands. High on Fire. The band is fronted by Matt Pike from doom metal legend Sleep, but High on Fire is much harder, faster, and hookier. Luminiferous is on Spotify, and it might be their best album yet. It's well worth checking out. Thanks for listening. I'll talk at you next week.